Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Teens No Cap. I'm your host, Charity Chafee. I'm a licensed mental health counselor specializing in the treatment of high-risk teens. Thank you so much for joining us today on another episode of the podcast. A podcast that I started that is now almost at 50 episodes, which is wild to me. But I think it shows me that when you commit to a project, you just slow and steady, consistency makes the win. So I appreciate you being here, and I'm so excited to talk to you about our topic today. Happy Friday. I'm not sure exactly what time it is where you're listening, but for me it is Friday night and hopefully on to weekend plans. I wanted to discuss a little bit of a different in-depth topic today because March, as many people know, is Self-Harm Awareness Month. And whether or not you yourself have been through bouts of self-injury, many, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people engage in self-harm behaviors and engage in high-risk behaviors that help manage their internal state. And so I felt like during the month of March, it was going to be a really important topic to discuss this, the hows, the whys, the behinds it, the etc., and what to do about that when you're in session with someone who is disclosing that to you. So self-harm is something that is still very taboo today. I think a lot of people have a misconception of what self-harm actually is. And I think that although we're doing better as a society and better as, clinicians in treatment, I do think that there are still a lot of improvements we could make when someone is engaging in self-harm. So I want to start off by talking about how self-harm to me, I actually make that a lot bigger and I encompass a lot of other things. So self-harm when I was growing up was basically just you're cutting, you're burning, you're breaking, you're doing some sort of bodily harm to your body. But I think when I look at it that way, even from that lens, there are a lot of other things that I would add into the category of self-harm. And I almost wish the DSM followed that because in the DSM, the only place that self-harm actually exists is under the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, which I feel like is both a disservice to people with borderline and also a disservice to people who harm. So I really wish there was a category in the DSM that essentially labeled self-harm as truly what it is, which is exerting external control over your body in some way that allows you to kind of control or cope and get through a situation that is hard and whatever, right? Difficult emotionally. So for me, when I talk about self-harm, I'm not just talking about cutting, burning, breaking, which are the traditional ones. I'm talking about disordered eating, substance use and abuse. I'm talking about high-risk sex practices. I'm talking about really kind of like erratic, sometimes impulsive choices that someone is making. Okay. And the thing about harm that we also should talk about is that anything in the wrong amount can be harmful. Anything in the wrong amount can be harmful. So for instance, people that often start off their fitness journey and they're like, I'm going to be super healthy, I'm not going to eat any processed food, I'm not whatever, end up in a space, right, of orthorexia, which is basically like, I'm so focused on only eating healthy, like nutrient-dense food that I now have an eating disorder, right? The people that start off being like, I'm going to go to the gym because the gym is really healthy for me, and then they end up there 4 or 5 times a day. Right? So we can, as a species, make a lot of different things into harm, varying the level and the intensity, the engagement, etc. So I know self-harm has often been touted as just self-harm, like cutting, burning, etc. But I think when you look at it on the broader lens, we can probably validate as a society that there are lots of things that we do, right, that would categorize themselves as harm that we're using to manage our internal state. And that's really all that self-harm is, right? Self-harm for a lot of people, I think, can be very scary. I think when you have a kid who's cutting, it can be terrifying for the parents. It's something that when you're like, seeing it, you're like, how could you do that? Why would you do that? How does that help the situation? But what I would want you to understand is that oftentimes the pattern of self-harm, right, not even necessarily the action, but the pattern, the neurological pattern, has often been building or has been built for years before sometimes we see that first, like, bigger gesture of self-harm. So I was reading a research article a long time ago, and they were talking about how even though the first demonstrated behavior of self-harm might not have been until someone was 15 or 16 years old, the pattern of that and the micro behaviors that built up to the bigger scaffolding of self-injury existed long, long before. as early as like 2, 3, 4, 9 years old, right? So I want you to I say that because I want you to understand that when we are talking about self-harm, we are not talking about something that just erratically started. We are not talking about something that just popped up overnight. We are talking about them finding a behavior, right, that now feels so close to them, so supportive, so comforting, right, that they're willing to engage in that even if people are noticing. And I think that's the other piece that I would want to talk about, is that oftentimes when you're noticing as a parent, a provider, a teacher, or whatever, that someone is engaging in self-harm, it likely has been happening for a very long time. And not just that one behavior, but an exploration of other behaviors in search of trying to get that feeling that they're craving. So in a lot of my clinical work, what I see is I will see teens, they kind of explore different ways of self-harm. They may not have committed to one specific way yet, but they will explore it. For instance, you will have someone who comes in initially struggling with some disordered eating, right? They might be purging, here and there. They might be restricting here and there. They're exploring what that sensation feels like in their body and if that helps them, right? Same thing with self-harm. You have a lot of people that will come in and they're like, yeah, I'm exploring this, or they won't use those words probably because they'll feel a lot of shame around it, but they'll talk a little bit about how they dabbled in different forms of self-harm and with different instruments and with different, ways and meanings, right? You get the people that are often, experimenting with drugs or different sex partners, right? There is that kind of exploratory period that we have that as a clinician, you have to be like really open and collaborative with, right? They're exploring because they're trying to find ways to manage that internal state. And we can add skills to that bucket without having to ask them to stop that one thing, right? But in true essence of harm reduction, which is where I focus from, we're not going to ignore the very real potential consequences of the choices they're making, right? But we're going to collaborate with them. We're going to give them a lot of information about like potential outcomes and what this could look like and what this could lead to. And we're really going to be talking about, their choices and how they make those choices and how they problem solve when we're talking about all of these different skills that they're using, right? So the example I will say is that if you are someone who let's say you lived off of donuts, right? You're like, oh, I love donuts. I could eat a donut every day. You love donuts. And then someone comes in and says, that's unhealthy. You can't do that. You need to stop, right? Now, as the person who's receiving that, you're like, what do you mean? Like, this is super healthy. Like, I love donuts. Donuts give me life. Donuts help me, survive until tomorrow. That is the exact same thing that someone with self-harm is experiencing when we are telling them that they have to stop, right? They don't have to do anything. They don't. They don't have to stop. They don't have to listen to us. They don't have to be there. They don't have to show up for session, right? So if you have someone in your office who is showing up to therapy, who is potentially actively cutting, that is a great situation to really lean into the curiosity and the collaboration behind tell me more about that, right? What is that like for you? I want to know the history. I want to know the nitty-gritty pieces. I want to know the what, where, when, right? I don't necessarily want to know the why, and I'll tell you why. I think when you have a teenager who is in your session and they are disclosing something that is, really painful or shameful or carries a lot of weight, we often get into this space of well, why, right? Like, why would you do that? And at the surface, it looks like a totally fine question. But the hard part about the why is that it actually puts that person in a state of defense. It puts them in a state of having to justify why they're using certain behaviors. It puts them in a state of essentially joining, right, with that behavior, whatever that behavior is, instead of being able to separate themselves from it. So when you are sitting with someone and they're suicidal and you're like, well, why? It actually puts them in a space where they have to justify that to you, right? And we don't want to make a client have to justify what they're doing. We don't want a teenager to have to defend a decision. We want to drop the armor and to be able to have conversations that are just collaborative and curious and help give us information about that whole process and how it started and where it started and when it started and, where it's at now. And I do think that assessing self-harm is something that we're not super good at, right? As a therapy world, right? That's not something we're trained in grad school with. We're trained to assess risk, but I think I would argue that risk assessments, even in like grad school, are fairly superficial because we don't really know what some of that stuff looks like, even if we're in a high-paced, high chaotic environment for internship, right? The risk assessment process comes with experience, it comes with time, and it comes with your ability to regulate yourself around self-harm and other behaviors that people are doing. So I think one of the things to be a really good clinician for someone who is like self-harming is you can't be scared, right? And we get very fearful. We get very like, oh, the liability of it all. But at the end of the day, if someone is like engaging in a self-harm behavior, whether that's disordered eating or high-risk sex practices or whatever, they're actively trying to stay on this planet, right? And that's the message I would want you to hear, is that if you have a teenager who's cutting, if you have, someone who's engaging in high-risk sex practices, they're actively trying to stay here, right? They're trying to figure out a way to feel better from whatever it is that is happening for them, right? And the whole idea of working through self-harm isn't to say you can't self-harm. It's to add skills to that bucket that help them see all the other things that they could be doing and engaging in, all the positive things that do bring them joy, right? And helping to build the scaffolding of that. So the other part I want to talk about is that oftentimes we look at things in a very black and white way. Amazing, considering we talk a lot about how black and white thinking is not helpful. We have black and white thinking in terms of self-harm. Often the question is, well, did you harm or did you not, right? And that question is really interesting and potentially divisive in your scenario, because if someone is choosing self-harm in that moment, there is a reason, and we want to be able to understand where their brain was at, where their head was at, where their heart was at. And we want to be able to understand the gray more than the surface level action. So, for instance, when you have someone who is like self-harming and they're working on, adding in other skills, the process of them being able to slow down and think about what they're doing and what the outcomes potentially might be for them is actually a huge step for them, even if they end up self-harming, right? The action of potentially seeking out somebody else or attempting to deal with that feeling in a different way and then eventually self-harming is actually different from where they started, likely, right? We see things in so black and white that it's kind of like you were successful or you weren't, right? But behavioral scaffolding doesn't actually work that way. And we have to like look at all of these different levels that are encompassed within that process, right? So I bought a Mustang, and I am a horse enthusiast. And what's really interesting to me about breaking and training Mustangs is that there's a lot of pressure and release that happens, which is actually like very similar to the therapeutic process in terms of what I'm looking for in session with someone who is self-harming. So for instance, if I need my horse to be able to kind of like give their forend, right? So we're talking about like them moving their butt, right? I am going to give a very clear signal to my horse, right? I'm going to be consistent, and I'm going to use that same signal every single time, right? When I'm first asking for that skill, I'm putting pressure on by asking with my body, right? And then the second my horse responds, even if they're just like shifting their weight or if they take a step, I'm rewarding that, right? And I think about that a lot in terms of like self-harm and dealing with high-risk behaviors, is because we are looking at this terms in very black and white. You need to stop the behavior, right? Instead, we have to break the behavioral scaffolding down, and we have to reward all those little tiny bids for effort, right? So the fact that my horse can sway his body, could be the very first step in building to that. I'm going to take 3 steps over because I know that's what you're looking for, right? And I know that humans are not horses. I understand that. But when we're talking about training and behavioral components, humans can get really confusing. We can make things really confusing. But I do think sometimes breaking it down into training animals, dogs, horses, etc., gives us a better understanding of how behavior is built and what we can do to navigate through that. So when I have a client who's working with self-harm stuff, I'm not just going to be, well, you failed because you self-harmed or you did this thing. I'm going to be looking at that entire process, and I'm going to be looking for that little tiny space where they gave and tried. And that's the thing that I want to focus on and reward and build on, right? And it could take a really long time to work through self-harm and to work through those patterns. I would argue that once you are someone who has self-harmed and you are kind of in recovery, that you are always going to be in recovery, right? People think that once you're done actually self-harming and using whatever behavior you're using, that all of a sudden you're just you're healed girly, you're good to go, you're never going to think about it again, right? But the problem with that mentality is that recovery is a lifelong thing, right? In the substance use field, they talk a lot about how relapse is a really important part of treatment and part of the process, and I really agree with that in terms of self-harm, because when we're thinking about decreasing a skill and not using it as much or veering away from it and adding all these other pieces into our lives, when we get stressed, when things go south, right, we again are looking for what's going to take the relief off, right, or what's going to bring the relief and take off the stress. And like humans are, we're going to try all of the things, right? And we may get to the point where that feeling, that emotion, that situation is so big that we revert back to other situations, other behaviors that we had used before. That is your relapse, right? Relapse tells us that we need to continue working on the skills, we need to continue working on the mindset, we need to continue working on those pieces. It doesn't tell us that you failed. It tells us that you met an obstacle that felt so big that you reverted back to something that maybe you don't want to do anymore, maybe isn't your choice, right? So we want to use relapse as a learning and growing opportunity instead of something to shame. So what often happens, what can happen in teen therapy especially, is when you have a client who's cutting, they're working really hard on all the other pieces in life, and maybe there hasn't been as many incidents of self-harm. And then there comes a point where something big happens or something, whatever really drastic happens, and the client ends up self-harming, engaging in high-risk sex practice, whatever the thing is. And the reaction from the parent and the reaction from the clinician needs to be very measured and calculated, because, again, we're not trying to induce shame, and we're not trying to shove them into a box, and we're not trying to make them do the thing we want them to do, right? So they engaged in the thing, and our job is to stay really curious. Tell me more about that, right? I want to understand the fine, tiny little micro pieces that went into that, so that we can understand this process and add things to it that are going to be more helpful, right? And again, even the more helpful thing is arguable, because I feel if you have a past history of self-harm or engaging in high-risk practices, that behavior for you actually is helpful, right? It's society that's sitting there being that's wrong, that's bad, you shouldn't do that, which I think is part of the harm reduction lens, in terms of we know relapse is going to happen. We're trying to decrease the shame around it. We know that, bad things do come from these situations. We're not going to shelter people from, potential negative impacts and negative consequences of behaviors they choose. But we also have to understand that a lot of people that are dealing with that, it does feel good. They do enjoy it. And I do think that that's something that's really hard, clinically speaking, for a lot of people who haven't been through it to understand, is because it's what do you mean that feels good for you, right? It's so perplexing, and I can understand that. But I also think if we're not talking about that entire system of how to them it does feel good, it is helpful, we're not really able to fully address them and understand the situation. So if you have someone who's in your practice who's actively working on decreasing self-harm or decreasing a behavior that they don't love, we have to think about it truly in terms of those small little micro steps. When I read this book last year, it was called like the 1% rule. And it's interesting because they talk about how like we're just doing 1% effort, 1% better, right? And the guy that wrote the book was talking about a cycling team, and he's like, they just focus on making one thing 1% better. And I wish we talked more about behavior like that in therapy, because I do think that there is this thing where you're going to wake up and you're just going to be like, I'm healed, I'm good to go. And we do that as a society with diet. We do that as a society with all this like change. We're just like overnight, we're going to be fine. How many times I'm absolutely guilty of this, but how many times have you as a person been like, okay, this week I'm going to eat really healthy, and I'm not going to eat any processed foods, and I'm going to go to the gym 5 times. I'm going to get up at 5:15 in the morning. I'm going to stretch every day and walk 10,000 steps, and it's going to happen, right? All of a sudden, we have this magical thinking that it's like, if I just impose this really strict, rigid thing, if I just do this one thing, I will be perfect and it will be fine, right? But if we instead implement change in micro steps where we're looking at the 1% better, right? So if you're looking at a dietary change, instead of having whole milk, you're going to have skim milk, right? You're going to have protein milk, right? That 1% change is something that you can build on every single day. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about high-risk behaviors, because we can't expect someone to go from harming 6, 7, 8 times a day, potentially, to just like not doing it the next day. Like, that's not real, right? But what we can do is we can look for that little area of pressure and release. We can look for the little gray area of like, oh, I see that you put some effort in there to like maybe make a different choice about how you wanted to manage that feeling, right? We're looking for those little tiny micro choices that we as clinicians, as parents, as whatever, can help them build off of to eventually build up to this big thing. So I do think that parents get really frantic. I think clinicians get really scared when they're talking about self-harm, because they're like, oh, like they have to stop that. They have to stop that. And really what it's saying to me is that you don't have the skills as a parent or as a clinician to regulate yourself enough to manage what that experience is like for them. So one of the things that I do a lot in treatment is if you have someone who's engaging in self-harm, it's working on the parent regulation and reaction skills, right? We want parents to be able to be very measured, very like neutral, very like supportive and curious without having the demand of like, well, you have to stop this thing, right? We know teenagers, if you tell them they have to stop something, they're going to figure out a way to do it anyway, right? That is like literally the teenage brain on fire. And so instead, we want to make space to be very collaborative with them in treatment. And part of that is not saying, I support you in cutting, right? That is not what we're saying when we're talking about, collaboration and curiosity. What it's saying is like, hey, I'm worried about you, and this doesn't seem like something that is going to be helpful long term, and I want to collaborate with you on things that might be like more helpful, right? And again, it could take months, it could take years to be able to get to the point where they are actively like in recovery, and all like, a major part of their self-harm is probably wrapped up, right? But one thing with harm reduction that, they talk a lot about is the relapse part, which then often means that, even if someone looks like they're done with certain things, there is a point where they're going to come back and engage in that again. And we have to be prepared for that, because that's already part of the neural pathway in that person. Instead, we want to look at it in terms of like this scaling of like, okay, but how often does that happen now, right? And if I'm working with someone and they're cutting 6 or 7 times a day, 8, 10 times a day, and all of a sudden, a year and a half later into treatment and they're cutting like once a day, that is like so much progress, right? We have to be able to identify those little tiny micro behaviors and feed into that, and to really identify the effort, the progress, the, how proud we are of them, how proud they should be of themselves, right? To show them that we are noticing and we are aware of all of those little tiny micro efforts that they are doing to work on that behavior. I've thought a lot about this podcast because I knew March was Self-Harm Awareness Month. And I think it is like a tricky conversation to have, and at the same time, one that I always really enjoy having, because I think that talking about self-harm in such different ways is really helping break the stereotypes and the stigma, and also giving people really good information about how to react, how to respond, how to be supportive, etc. I know it's a heavy topic for a Friday night, and at the same time, I'm very excited you were here to listen and to engage in this conversation. And I do hope that you drop some thoughts below, any feedback you might have on, your thoughts and feelings. If you're someone that's gone through self-harm, I'd love to connect and hear more about your story and maybe even have you on the podcast. But I'll wrap it up with that for today, and hopefully you have a really great weekend. But don't forget to like, follow, subscribe. I'd love to hear your stories. I'd love to connect with you. If you are a clinician who's treating teens, please join the school community. It is free. I host monthly case consultations and also monthly private practice building sessions where we talk a lot about business, because I'm also an entrepreneur and I really love being able to hold both hats. So thank you again for joining us. Until next time.